In this lecture, we will continue and complete our discussion of the Olivet Discourse from Matthew 24:25, Mark 13, and Luke 21. We have seen so far that in the discourse, Jesus has been talking about the events that will occur from the first century when he gave the discourse until his second coming. He concentrated, so he did that in Matthew 24, 4 through 14. Then in verses 15 through 21, he concentrated on the destruction of the temple, because that was the occasion why the disciples, they pointed out, look at how beautiful the temple is. And Jesus said, I tell you, not one stone is going to remain on another. And then they said, well, tell us, when are these things going to happen, and what is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So he concentrated in verses 15 through 21 on the destruction of the temple. And it was in that context that he talked about the abomination of desolation and the great tribulation. We talked about that in the last lecture. But then beginning in verse 22, he shifted gears, and you have to pick up the language change. He says, but those days, because he'd been asked two things, basically. When's the destruction of the temple going to happen, and when are you coming again, and the age going to end? I'm sure the disciples thought that the two were the same thing. They did not realize that they were different. But Jesus, in his language, said, but of those days, namely my coming, there will be, unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved, but for the sake of the elect, they will be cut short. And then he talks about in verses 22 through 26, signs that did occur in the first century, but have continued to occur and will continue until Christ comes again, namely false Christ. If anyone says, here is Christ, or there is Christ, don't believe him, because false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Which, by the way, a little footnote here, don't believe, the fact that somebody can do great signs and wonders or miracles is not a sign that he is even saved. Jesus is saying there will be false prophets who can do these things. And if you look in Matthew 7, verses 21 through 23, at the day of judgment, Jesus says, many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord. They'll even call him Lord. And look at all the things we did for you. We cast out demons in your name, and we did this in your name. And Jesus will say, I never knew you. Go to hell. So you've got to use your discernment. It's only through the Word of God. If they teach and their lifestyle is consistent with the Word of God, that reveals whether, if they love, that reveals whether they're true disciples or not. Not that they can work miracles. But then in verse 27 of Matthew 24, he says, for just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Now, so in context, I mean, he was saying that there'll be people saying, oh, there's the Christ over there. No, he's saying it's going to be like the lightning. Everybody is going to see when I come again. I'm not going to be hidden away in a corner. And furthermore, the reference to lightning may well imply judgment, because when he comes, he will bring judgment. The first time he came in lowliness, but in Revelation 19, it says, when he comes again, he will come to judge and wage war. So the lightning may be associated with, if not identical to, fire from heaven, which always indicates God's judgment in the Bible. Now, the reference to the vultures, again, the imagery is somewhat unclear. It may, again, the most natural application would be the judgment, which may be the point of his reference to where the corpse is, there the vultures will be also. So because that is, vultures are flesh-eating birds, and in Revelation chapter 19, in connection with the second coming of Christ, it talks about in Revelation 19, 21 it says, "And the rest were killed with the sword which came from the mouth of him who sat on the horse, and all the birds were filled with their flesh." So it may be a reference to that. On the other hand, at minimum, it would indicate that just, as surely as you know when you see vultures that there's a carcass or a corpse, you're not going to miss the coming of the Son of Man. But then in verses 29 through 31, he talks about, more specifically, the glorious return. He says, "But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet. They will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other." Now, he talks about immediately after the tribulation of those days in verse 29. Now, that reference to the tribulation may relate back to the great tribulation he had talked about in verse 21, which dealt with the destruction of Jerusalem. Or it may be referring to tribulation that the church will face shortly before Jesus comes again. In either case, the events cannot be limited either to the events of AD 70 or solely to the events of just before Jesus comes again, but must include the tribulation that the church will face throughout the period between the first and second coming of Christ. Because the reference to the tribulation, when he says, but immediately after the tribulation in those days, suggests, if it's referring back to the great tribulation of AD 70, suggests that what happened in AD 70 is the beginning of tribulation. But the tribulation does not end then. Now, the church will continue to face tribulation throughout the period of time before Christ comes again. And so, in other words, as we saw, in AD 70, it was the physical temple that was destroyed, but we are now the true temple. And so, immediately after the destruction of the temple in AD 70, the church was now recognized as separate from Judaism. And therefore, immediately thereafter, the church started facing tribulation, being thrown to the lions and so on and so forth by the Romans. And so, in other words, the true temple, the church, has continued to face tribulation for the last 2,000 years and will continue to do so up until Christ comes again. But the fact that this reference, cannot, so it can't refer only to the events of the AD 70, but also the Great Tribulation here cannot refer simply to the events immediately before Jesus comes again, because then it would be pointless to say that the Great Tribulation, is greater than anything that until now nor ever will. I mean, if he's just coming again, then it would be pointless to say this tribulation, is greater than anything past or in future, because the future is coming to an end when Christ comes again. And so when he talks about, and again, in verse 29, he talks about the tribulation of those days. So I think it's referring kind of inclusively to tribulation that occurs throughout the period of the church up until the time Christ comes again. Now, it talks about the signs, but the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall. Those signs may be figurative, because frequently in the Bible, you look in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, Ezekiel, Similar language was used for great political events. So the reference here may be figurative. I think, however, they may be literal. Why? Because we're seeing an escalation of things. Jesus is now talking about the consummation of all of history. And as one commentator points out, that the signs Jesus lists in the cosmos are probably meant to be taken literally because of the climactic nature of the Son of Man's final coming and final self-disclosure. And so, you think about it theologically, as we've said, when Christ comes again, not only is there going to be resurrection and judgment, but the cleansing and renewal of the entire earth. And so all these signs in the heavens, because people worship the heavens, Ra, the sun god of the Egyptians, and so on, which suggests that humanity has become perverted in its worship. We worship the creation rather than the creator, and therefore creation itself, the sun, the moon, the stars, the earth, etc., need to be judged and destroyed and cleansed, which is what is being suggested here in verse 29. Then it talks in verse 30 about the sign of the Son of Man. What the actual sign is somewhat difficult to say. It may be simply his coming. Some have taken it to be, the fact that he appears. Some have said that, have taken it that we will see the sign of the cross in the heavens. I tend to think, particularly when it talks about the sign of the Son of Man appearing on a cloud, I think that's probably the Shekinah glory cloud. It was present in the wilderness and led Israel, and coming on the clouds, I tend to, my personal opinion is that is the specific sign, the Shekinah glory cloud in which he will come. Now, it says coming on the clouds with great power and great glory. That actually is a quotation from Daniel 7, verses 13 and 14, where it says, "With the clouds of heaven, one like the Son of Man was coming, and he came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him, and to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom," which again is one reason why preterists say that they take this for something that happened in AD 70, because in Daniel, which is being quoted here, the Son of Man was going up to the Ancient of Days. Well, in one sense, you can look at Jesus' resurrection and ascension as fulfilling that. He receives the kingdom, but in Acts 1, remember, Jesus ascended. The disciples were looking up, and then the angel said, "Why are you looking up?" Because the Son of Man is coming back down the same way. So I think his ascension and his return are related, and they're related in Acts 1:11 by the angel. And so I think that what we see here is he receives the kingdom in one sense when he ascends to the Father in heaven. Now he's reigning on the throne of David, according to Acts chapter 2. But he receives the kingdom in another sense when he comes again. So the two are related. So I think this is a reference to the coming back of the Son of Man. And again, he comes, it says he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet. They will gather together his elect from the four winds. Remember, that's exactly what Jesus said in the parable of the wheat and the tares. When he said the Son of Man will send forth his angels, they will gather out of his kingdom all the stumbling blocks, those who commit lawlessness, and will throw them into the furnace of fire. We see a similar thing to that in Revelation chapter 14. The reference to the great trumpet is, I think we find that is a quotation from Isaiah 27, verse 13, and we see other references to that in the New Testament. So the events of the second coming of Christ, they're going to be audible, the great trumpet. They're going to be visible. No one will mistake this. But then he tells the parable of the fig tree, beginning in verse 32. And he says, "Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For in those days, before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying, giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. There will be 2 men in the field, one will be taken, one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one will be left." Now, some people have erroneously said that when he talks about when you see the fig tree, that Jesus is right at the door. And they said, well, that refers to the refounding of the nation of Israel in 1948. Well, no, it can't possibly. Luke's parallel account talks about the fig tree and all the trees. What he's doing is giving an agricultural metaphor. He's saying, when you see these things that I've been talking about, know that the destruction of Jerusalem is coming. And because remember, look at, he says, verse 33, you too, when you see all these things, and then in verse 34, this generation will not pass away. So there he's speaking to his disciples, that generation 2,000 years ago. So, what he's saying is, you will see the temple fall. And what he's saying is, verse 34, it sets a beginning point. When this generation will not pass away till all these things take place. He's setting a beginning point, but not an end point. The technical term is he's giving us a terminus a quo, the earliest limiting point, but not a terminus ad quem, the latest limiting point. In other words, he could come any time after the temple was destroyed. So, he's right at the door. We're in the last days. John says, 1 John 2, verse 18, we are in the last hour. So he could have come in the first century. He could come back to earth. He might not come for another 1,000 years. We don't know. But no one knows when he's coming again. So simply he's saying, from the time of the destruction of the temple, I could come at any time. I could have come, AD 70, but I didn't. I could have come 1970, but I didn't. I could have come 2020, but I haven't so far. I might not come till 3050. Who knows? But take a look at, the language he used. We contrasted the language he used in verse 21 and 22 when he talked about, in verse 15, when you see the abomination of desolation, then those in Judea, versus verse 22, those days no life would be saved. He does the same thing. In the parable of the fig tree, he says, you too, when you see these things, I say to you, this generation. But verse 36, but of that day and hour, no one knows. And so he's contrasting the near and the far. He's contrasting all these things, namely the events leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem, and this generation with that day, namely his second coming. And so, again, you look at, he talks about you and this generation as opposed to people in general. In verse 36, no one knows. Now he's not talking specifically to this generation, but he's talking in general. And so then in and he does this, and in the book I have a number of specifics. He addresses people either personally when he's talking about the events of that generation, or generally when he's talking about the second coming. And you should also know that the term "that day and hour" or "that day" is is called a term of art. In other words, it is a well-defined eschatological denotation of the second coming itself. And so, when in this regard, I want to conclude this lecture by pointing out that the second coming of Christ is totally unpredictable. Now, one of the things we need to remember is that prophetic signs are not designed to enable one to calculate when or how a prophesied event will occur. Prophecy is different from history. It's not intended to give us specific details so that we can calculate dates. It's designed basically to cause us to be alert, to cause us to change our life, to put away our sin, and to live holy lives in light of the fact that Jesus is coming at a time we do not expect. And so the signs of the times are open-ended. I mean, he talked about earthquakes, famine, wars, rumors of war. These are general things that have happened all through history and will continue to do so. Some people say, oh, now there are more earthquakes now. And no, the number of earthquakes goes up, then it goes down. We don't know where we are on the scale. Every generation tends to think we're right at the end, when we might be just a little bump down here, you see. Some people think, and erroneously, that, there'll be some Antichrist. We'll talk about Antichrist in a future lecture, or the presence of tribulation will enable us to predict when the second coming occurs. Well, excuse me, if, as Jesus said, that not even the angels of heaven nor the Son know, but only the Father, then why do you think you can calculate when he's coming again? The point of when he says, those days, the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. And then he says, before the flood, people were eating and drinking and marrying, going about their normal business. And then he says, 2 men in the field, one taken, one left, 2 women grinding, one taken, one left. In other words, people were continuing with the normal daily routines of life, and then the flood came and took them all away. It came as a surprise to everybody. That's what Jesus is saying. His coming, we're not going to be able to predict it. Yes, there may be increased persecution, but increased persecution has occurred in various times and places throughout history. This will continue. And there's nothing, not by looking up at the sky or watching the evening news on the TV or looking at your newspaper or seeing what's happening in the Middle East, nothing will enable us to calculate when he's coming again at all. It will take everybody by surprise, including Christians. And that's why he tells the parables at the end of Matthew 24. He tells the parable of the unjust steward. Then he tells in Matthew 25 the parable of the 10 virgins. Some had oil for their lamps and some didn't. And then the parable of the talents. The point of all of those parables is that the master has gone away, and then he comes at a time when no one expects him. And the issue is, remain faithful now for the precise reason that we don't know when he's coming again, and we can't calculate it. Because if we knew, or if we could calculate when he's coming again, then we could say, I can take my ease. I don't have to obey him now because I know he's not coming for another 10 years or 20 years or whatever. And then I can get ready. No, he could come now. He might not come for 1,000 years. So the point is, it's because we don't know when he's coming that we need to remain faithful. And again, the reference to the day and hour, he says in Matthew 24, verse 36, no one knows the day or the hour. Some people say, well, you can at least know the week or the month or the day, or the week or the month or the year or the decade or the century. No, the day or the hour are not in contrast to weeks, months, years, or centuries. The day and the hour are a technical term referring to the second coming itself. And so what he's saying is, you won't know when I'm coming. So it's a technical term referring to the second coming, not a literal day or hour in contrast to week, month, or year. And we know this because in Acts 1, verse 7, the apostles ask, well, now are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel? And Jesus said, it's not for you to know the times or the epochs which the Father has fixed by his own authority. Now, the words there basically refer to great duration of time, to epochs of time. Sometimes they refer to entire lifetimes, the times of entire empires, and so on. So what he's saying is, you won't know within 1,000 years when I'm coming again. So don't try and figure it out. That's not the purpose of why I'm saying this. I'm saying it so that you will remain faithful, precisely because I'm not telling you and I'm not giving you any hint or any clue as to when I am coming again. I mean, the whole point of the Olivet Discourse, insofar as we are concerned, is to stress we are to live faithfully now because it is impossible to know when he comes again. And let me conclude that some people, dispensationalists, they often presume that these signs enable us to calculate in a general way when he's coming again. They look to the rebirth of Israel, and they think, some people have written, that means that the coming will be within a generation. And there were books written, and people preached that, okay, a generation in the Bible is 40 years. And so 40 years from 1948 is 1988, but then you have to back that up 7 years for the tribulation, because that's when the rapture is going to happen. Well, it didn't happen. Well, then they said, oh, Israel took Jerusalem in 1967, so 40 years, that's 2007. You back that up for 7-year tribulation, so the rapture will occur in 2000. Didn't happen. You see, because that's foolishness, because if you could calculate things along that way, then you could know when Christ is coming again. But Jesus specifically said, you don't know when I'm coming again. You can't even calculate in a general way the times, the seasons, the epochs. You can't calculate at all. So there is no event that is going to happen in the Middle East or anywhere else in the world that will tell us when Christ is coming again. So again, let me conclude this lecture by saying that what Jesus is doing in the Olivet Discourse, he was telling us and telling his disciples, they thought the temple was so wonderful. And it was the most magnificent building in the world. But he said, there's not one stone that's going to remain on top of the other. When's this going to happen? When are you coming again? When's going to be the end of the age? And he told us that the destruction of the temple would happen in their lifetime. And it happened in AD 70. And he gave them some signs to look for. But then he also said, when I'm going to come again, it's not going to be then. Now, I could have come at any time after the temple was destroyed, but actually no one knows when. I could come soon, I could come late. He used kind of subtle language that distinguished you from people in general. These things from that day, and other language to show that there is going to be a period of time between the destruction of the temple and the second coming. But it is coming, and no one is going to mistake it. And when it comes, that is when he is going to, there'll be resurrection. He will gather his wheat into the barn and throw the tares into the fire. The angels will come. They are the reapers. And so there will be no mistake. And since that is coming, and it's going to transform everything, we need to be faithful now. Those are the big points of the Olivet Discourse.